Double stops. They unlock the door to a higher level of playing, and today, I'm going to show you how to master them the simple way. I can't wait to share these secrets with you because double stops were a weakness of mine for many years. It's said that you teach best what you need to learn most, and I paid the price to get my double stops in shape. Today, I'll share with you the secrets that unlocked my double stops and show you a clear way of practicing them so you feel successful from day one. So why are double stops so important? Perhaps the most important reason is because they force us to start thinking in terms of groups of notes rather than individual notes. This concept of thinking in groups of notes even helps us when we're playing individual notes. For example, when we're playing fast runs, instead of thinking about each individual note, we can think in terms of finger patterns. Take the fast runs in La Folia, for example. Instead of thinking of each one of those individual notes, which to be honest there isn't time for, I can think in terms of finger patterns. So for this first run, on the A string I use this finger pattern, and then on the D string I use this finger pattern. So instead of thinking about a bunch of notes, I can just think finger pattern, and those are the only two things I need to think about. The second reason double stops are so important is because they might be the very best thing for ear training and intonation. Intonation is all about understanding relationships between notes. What's the distance from this note to another note? And when we practice double stops, that's exactly what we're mastering. And when you're hearing both notes being played at the same time, your ear can really lock into it and say, is that completely in tune or not? You also have the advantage of what are called Tartini tones, named after a famous violinist. When a chord is perfectly in tune, the overtones of the notes line up in such a way that it actually creates a third pitch. And that third pitch can be something that your ear latches onto and finds very, very satisfying, which again will help to train your ear. I'll give you an example of a Tartini tone. So I'll start with it a little bit out of tune and then start to slide it into place. See if you can hear the Tartini tone emerge, the third note. Hear it? That's the pitch. You can see how this could be a very powerful tool in terms of training your ear. Finally, double stops train the right arm in a very special way. Not only do you have to exert a little bit more arm weight and pulling force in order to get two strings to respond rather than one, but it also forces you to have very accurate bow angles because you have to be able to hit both strings completely evenly in order for the pitch to not get distorted. If I change my weight slightly to the D or to the A, you'll hear a bend in the pitch. So hopefully I've convinced you that double stops are important. If I have a student who's practicing 3 hours a day, we usually devote about 30 minutes to double stop work in their scales. The way I like to start practicing double stops is in my scales. And if you're just starting out, I would recommend using a pretty simple scale system, which would be Barber scale system for advanced violinists, which I have linked below. This will pave the way for us to get into more advanced scale systems like Carl Flesch. The first and most important rule you want to be thinking about with your double stops is to never leave a note until you love the way it sounds. Early on, what we're training more than anything else is our ear. And so I want you to be incredibly patient when it comes to adjusting your intonation. And I also want you to constantly use a drone. If you haven't used a drone before, it's basically just a pure pitch that is played with perhaps some other overtones around it that help you to center your intonation. I've just created a playlist of drones that should be enjoyable to listen to while you're working on your double stops. Drones are one of those useful practice tools that you can simply turn on and it will make you better without even having to think about it. When selecting your drone, make sure to pick the pitch of the scale that you're doing. So if I'm doing G major, I'll pick a G drone. Now if you're very diligent about that first rule, to never leave a note until you love the way it sounds, you should be successful with your double stops from the very beginning. In order to help you to keep that first rule, I want to give you a series of stages so that you can be successful from day one. These stages are applicable to every single double stop and is the way that we'll progress through each one of them. The first stage is to play the two notes separately and then to play them together. When doing this stage, follow the rule of placing the lower number finger first. Not the lower pitch, the lower number finger first. So for octaves, that would be the lower string. But with thirds, for example, it would be the upper pitch, the lower number finger. When you're doing this stage, be so diligent about not leaving a pitch until it's perfectly in tune. The more careful you are on the separate notes, the less you will have to adjust when you put both notes together. You'll notice a couple of notes were not initially perfectly in tune. No stress, just make sure that you take the time to adjust them, lock them in, and then move on. Let me share some keys for success at this stage. First of all, you should be very patient. When you're practicing your double stops at this stage, I want it to have almost a meditative quality to it. There shouldn't be any hurry to go on to the next note. When you miss a note, you shouldn't beat yourself up. You should just calmly adjust it till it's locked into place and then move on. Next, be sure to focus on your right hand first. Good sound is the first step to good intonation. Unless this is pulling pure sound, your ear won't be able to hear clearly what it needs to adjust. Third, make sure that you are not overpressing with the left hand. It can be tempting, particularly if you're new to double stops, to press harder than you need to. Always with the left hand, we're trying to exert the smallest amount of pressure necessary in order to create a clean cutoff and a good sound. With double stops, this is especially true because sometimes after we place our first finger, when we apply force to the second finger, not only do we add pressure to this finger, but we also increase the amount of pressure that we put down on the first finger that we placed. At the end of the day, you want even pressure applied to both fingers, and you want it to be the minimum amount necessary to create a clean sound. Now, ideally, if you've been patient at setting the separate notes correctly, you shouldn't need to adjust when you start playing them together. However, we are human, and when we place the second finger, sometimes we can adjust the positioning of the first finger. There can be a little bit of roll as we're going to the second finger. Of course, we want to avoid this. But if you find yourself out of tune when you place these two notes together, it's important to try not to adjust both fingers at the same time. This just creates a hot mess, and it's really hard for us to pinpoint what needs to be adjusted. Instead of that, use the lower number finger as an anchor point, and then adjust the other finger to it. So I'm gonna play this slightly out of tune. Notice how I adjust the upper finger to match the lower number finger. So without moving the first finger at all, I slowly moved the fourth finger in the direction I knew we needed to go until it locked into place. I also want to try to avoid going past the correct pitch many times, like this. I want to use very, very small motions and simply move it into place. And then you want to linger there for a couple of bow lengths and make sure the pitch is pure. The next stage is where we grab the second note. Just like the previous stage, we want to follow our rule of never moving on from a note or a chord unless we love the way that it sounds. Don't get so locked into the rhythm of how you're doing the exercise that you're not willing to take extra bows if you need to continue to adjust your pitch. One thing about this stage is as you get better at it, it can be helpful to spend less and less time on the first note. You can do this until it's almost simultaneous. This will help you as you transition to the next stage. The next stage is playing both fingers exactly together, or as it is written in the music. The last key to success that I really want to talk about is the shifting involved. When you're doing these double stops, particularly in the early stages, I want you to be really, really obvious about your shifts. And if you haven't already watched my videos on shifting, particularly the one that speaks about release and timing, be sure to go do that because that's an essential part of making sure that your shifts are easy in your double stops. When you're doing your double stop shifts, we want to be extra careful that we're really releasing for every single shift. Along with releasing, make sure you're using your ear and a ghost note to make sure that you are nailing the pitch every time. I don't want to leave this up to guesswork. There's already enough variables to think about. Just make your shifts as obvious as possible with the goal of never missing a shift. The next stage is transitioning chords underneath a slur. This stage is powerful because it forces you to make the transitions rather quickly, but it still gives your brain plenty of time to think about the transition. Because the transition is underneath a slur, you have to make sure that the release and timing of the shifts works really well and that you're placing your fingers with speed. I also find that it encourages the left hand to not overpress. After that comes 2 chords per bow. You could think of it as eighth notes. And sky's the limit after that. You can do triplets, you can do 16th notes. We just basically want to continue to get faster and push our limits in terms of what we're capable of. When doing this, however, don't forget our first rule. Don't move on from a chord until you love the way it sounds. Don't push yourself speed-wise if the accuracy isn't there. Now, when you're first getting into double stops, I would really just stay on stage 1. Once you can play the whole scale of octaves perfectly in tune 3 times in maybe 10 minutes, I'd say you're ready to move on to the next stage. When I say move on to the next stage, I still think you should always start by doing stage 1. But then instead of doing 3 repetitions of stage 1, you could do a repetition of stage 1, a repetition of stage 2, and then possibly a repetition of stage 3, as long as you're not compromising your accuracy. As you get more and more proficient with these stages, you can start to move in between the stages mid-scale. It's all about knowing what's possible for you and how you're feeling on any given day. Sometimes I move very fluidly from stage 1 to stage 4 and I get there very quickly. On other days, even as a professional, I have to linger longer in the earlier stages to make sure I'm feeling comfortable. All that matters is that every moment that you're practicing your scales, you're reinforcing good habits and you're not cutting corners and developing bad habits. Now that you know this basic framework for practicing scales, let's get into the nitty-gritty of every double stop, starting with what I would consider to be the most important double stop, octaves.